Hello, this is Dr. Stephen Bujno here at St. Joseph's College, Maine's Catholic Moral Theology course. This is Unit 2, Lesson 4, Law and Ethics. Now, in a couple lectures past, what we did is present the idea of nominalism that denies a universal, so there's no nature or essence to a thing. And then I tried to tie in how that nominalism relates to both freedom and then virtue. And then we covered exactly how freedom should be understood. So freedom is the ability to do that which we are designed to do. Now, with this present topic on law, let's try to put that aside, those ideas that would help us understand this in the proper way. And let's ask, like the average person would, if they first heard, or at least were asked, can you explain to me what you think law is in terms with ethics? They're probably going to speak about something as duty-based. In other words, if you're going to talk about ethics in terms of law, it's about following the rules. And if you bring the Catholic Church or any dogmatic structure into it, they're going to say now it's the law based on policing our behavior. Now, a lot of us have grown up by following the rules. But in all fairness, this was when we were younger. We were not yet quite rationally developed. So our in this pre-emancipatory stage before we were adults, we needed directives because our reasoning ability was not really matched to our experiences in the world. So we had no way to deal with it except to follow the laws in order for us to be both safe and good. Here's an analogy for an example. Now, when my three daughters were very young, we live across from an elementary school, so there's traffic at certain times of the day. If my daughters were outside in front, whether they were on the sidewalk or in the front yard, my wife would tell them to stay out of the street because cars bite. Now, I sort of smirked at that and chided my wife by asking her, why do you say this? Being much wiser than me, she explained that our children have no experience of getting hit by a car. So you can't simply say, don't go out into the street, you'll get hit by a car. What does that mean to them? But almost all children understand what it's like to get bit, and they know that being bit hurts. So if you can somehow transfer the experience of being bit and how that hurts to being hit by a car and that hurts, then they understand that they don't want to do either of those. Now, the problem is that this idea, if we're talking about this and how we've inherited all of this, the problem is that this idea of the term law being an attitude of obeying, this is something that we may have learned when we were younger, but now it has been carried over into our adult years. For instance, many adult Catholics who no longer practice the faith are highly critical of it, and they even try to criticize it in theological, terms. But they do that with maybe nothing more than a 6th grade, or even at the best, 7th or 8th grade understanding of the Catholic faith. So it's an immature approach to a very difficult, sometimes complex situation. Could you imagine if somebody were to try to present themselves as an expert in biology and they referred back to their 9th grade biology class? We would find that to be lacking at the very least humility and perhaps wisdom too. So nonetheless, many adults live with an immature understanding of things, and just like my daughters had to learn as they got older that what happens getting hit by a car is much more serious than being bit, but the law, if you want to call it that, at least kept them safe in the meantime. So my overarching point here is that we have quite the history within the Catholic Church where systems of obligation, they themselves became the basis for our behavior in terms of moral theology. So the Manualist Tradition, it rose in the 17th century as a pedagogical means to do primarily two things. One, it developed rules from principles that were known for their certitude. So if you knew the principles and you can say these things are true, then you had to get rules that they thought would work off of those principles. The second thing was they applied those rules to cases in order to prescribe proper courses of action. Now, I'll explain what that means. The intent here was in part to offer priests a necessary means to be merciful to penitents within the confessional. So, in other words, if a person came in and this was their moral quandary or concern, the priest then, working off of some sort of principle that was known for certitude, where a rule has been developed, can be merciful and make sure that they are at the very least being just in how they're prescribing some sort of penance, or, just to be honest, some sort of dialogue back with the penitent. But there was an unintended consequence in this manualist tradition. What arose out of this was a continued separation of spirituality from personal morality. So to be moral was simply to do the right thing. Everything was basically, reduced down to these acts of conscience. And priests, even in their vocationally formed education, they studied these manuals. So they didn't have, nor were they given direct access to both Scripture and the Church Fathers. They learned from the manuals, which they themselves were based on that. But you can see there's a degree of separation there. So the term law, then, it arose in people's morality as a development in response to the directives from these manuals. Rather than what we're doing here, an ethic rooted in the understanding of the human person and the genuine goods for that human person. So, Vatican II tried to address this. So one of the two treasures I'll quick mention, is from Vatican II, we start talking about the universal call to holiness. So in other words, be like your God. It's not just about doing the right thing, it's about being. And the other one, and that was absent from quite some time prior. So this idea of some golden age prior to Vatican II doesn't really stand up to scrutiny historically. The other thing is that, we now, both laity and ordained, are all understood to be the people of God. So there's, a sense there that now the spirituality and virtue formation has to, imbue this. So we're trying to reframe how we understand law to work in conjunction with that. So I'm not here to work out a recent history of this moral theology. Real quick, condensed version, just to stress how this casuistry, which I did say is a concern from it became an instance of understanding one's morality only in relation to particular acts, and then everything were identified as cases of conscience. What we're really trying to do here is we want to determine one's life in regard to happiness as the pursuit of genuine goods. That's the goal, in line with our authentic personal freedom. So we're trying to undo the focus where individual acts were in relation to prescribed laws, and morality simply became interpreted as legalistic. Now, we began this presentation from a different point of view. We're sort of like reorienting our thinking. So rather than determining rules that are to be followed, we try to discover a design in the human person, and the closer that our moral acts and judgments are in line with that design that we can understand, then the freer we are in our own moral lives. Now, in this way, then, we can say that wherever there is a design in the human person, then that design presupposes a designer. If we can just switch the words design and designer with law and lawgiver, then we're going to be able to say that the law presupposes a lawgiver. Now, the way this works out is this design is determining the good, which will lead to our desired end, in the same way that the proper use of a pen is the way to freely use it because you're using it in line with this design. So the law is what guides that good to the end based on design. And in this way, then, we can honestly and legitimately say that there is no freedom outside of law. So we use the proposition that if X is proper for a human end, whatever that might be, then X ought to be done. And the converse is true. If X is not proper for a human end, then X ought not to be done. So again, we find the design of the human person, we find what is proper for the human person, and then we say that we ought to do that, and that we're understanding of law. So a screwdriver, everybody has used a screwdriver to try to hammer a nail in or something, or we've used a butter knife as a screwdriver. But we know that there are limits to that. It's not that you can't use a butter knife to turn, the screw on a faceplate for an electrical outlet or something, but we also know that it only works sort of, and not usually very well. And if we use a screwdriver too much as a hammer, we're going to ruin the handle. So you get the idea. Now, in morality, we would say that what is proper for a human end is natural for the human person. But I just want to bring something up, because this dichotomy or discussion always enters the conversation at some point, where people confuse human nature with what is natural in the natural world. So you might have heard somebody argue, if you're talking about this or that, they'll say, well, this species or that species can be found in nature to have certain attributes, or this happens in nature. Well, if it happens in nature and we're part of nature, therefore it's natural to man. That sounds convincing, but there's some issues with that. Like, here's an example. If somebody were to say, why does the Catholic Church stress monogamy? Because it's so rare amongst the animal species in the natural world. And isn't the human person just an animal? Well, if it's not natural for the other species in the natural world, then it's not natural for us as human beings. Now, the reality about this is that before, well, I guess I should wrap that up simply by saying this, that what we are talking about is not what is found in the natural world, but what is found in human nature. And in order for us to determine what is found in human nature, we're going to work through some of the laws, particularly natural law, will basically reveal something in that regards. But let's first define what exactly a law is. It's always important, as I said in the lecture on virtues and such, to know what the definition of a thing is. And usually the elements of that definition themselves have to be properly understood. So I'll give you a definition for law, and then from that we'll talk about exactly what the four components of this and how important they are to understand. So if we're going to talk about a law as a command of reason for the common good by somebody who has care for the community and must be promulgated, the four particular notions in there. One is it's a command of reason. So this could be understood, right? So it's a practical reason, which is directed to a specific choice. It's not some theoretical thing. Now, as far as the common good, if we'll talk about this when we get into social justice, but if a common good is a total sum of conditions that are necessary for us either as individuals or as a society to flourish, then this has to work towards that. So this can't be something that's only good for some. It has to be what's good for all. Okay. The third thing is it has to be basically originating in a legitimate authority. It cannot simply be from some despot or just from somebody who's in a more anarchical situation. So somebody who has care for the community has to be the source of this particular law. And the fourth thing is that it has to be promulgated. So it has to be made known, or at least available to be known. Now, before we start thinking, well, what about if we don't know that? Natural law has a way to address that. Now, when we talk about law as a definition that covers, all the types, I'll offer four types: eternal, divine, natural, and human. I'll talk a little bit farther on natural than I will on the other three, but we'll mention them all here. So eternal law is the law that is in God's own mind. In other words, this is the Logos. So when you read in the first chapter of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, that term word literally means Logos. So this is the divine wisdom of the Trinity that's directing all actions and all movements to their proper ends. We don't have direct access to this essence. I'll explain how we understand that in a second. Divine law is divinely revealed. So this is typically through sacred scripture. It's the law, which is the Logos. It's the law as it appears to humans through revelation. So we have the old law, which would be the old covenant, and the new law, which is the new covenant. Natural law. Now, this is our participation in eternal law. That's a good short definition. Natural law being man's participation in eternal law. So this is clear then, or it should be clear, in this way that we image God. Now, I'm going to elaborate a little bit here on natural law, and I want to return to an understanding of the human person's nature as opposed to that what's found in the natural world, right? So natural law, this could be known by unaided use of human reason. Now, before we say, well, we just do it on our own, remember that even this itself is a grace. So, in a basic sense, natural law, it's intelligible to every person. The ability to know by reason, this is what elevates us as human persons above all other animals. It's also what gives us our dignity, because we are not susceptible merely to our instincts, which is what some people would think of when they hear the natural world. We may chastise a dog or a pet that does not go outside to the bathroom, and we might even call that particular pet bad, but we really do not mean that, because the dog is simply doing what the dog does. We would not hold children against that action either, but anybody of the age of reason or above, we would. All right. So the reality is with natural law is that there are three various manifestations of it, we'll call precepts: the primary, the secondary, and the remote. Now, these primary precepts, they're known as natural inclinations, and this is why it's important to understand these are the human nature as opposed to what is found in the natural world. These are general, and they are known by all. They are self-evident. Now, the first one is to do good and avoid evil. This is the principle of beneficence. It's the first principle of morality. Even if we are confused on what is evil, we always do that which we think is good. The second one is to seek truth. In other words, basically just to gain knowledge. The third one is to preserve one's own life. And I'm going to elaborate on that one in a second. And this includes respect for other individuals. The fourth one is procreation and then education of children, because unlike other animals in the natural world, our children are not emancipated just upon birth. There's a slow maturation process. So this whole transmission of life is guided by reason. And I'd rather leave the fourth one as procreation and education of children as opposed to marriage, which sometimes it's listed. That has a different context for me. And anyway, the fifth one is to live in society. This would include anything that involves family structures, institutions to help us flourish and such. Now, the reality is that these things cannot not be known, but they also fall into what we would call, once we apply rational knowledge to these 5 precepts, we can identify secondary precepts. Secondary precepts, they're a little more difficult to know because they become a further application of the primary principles. And I am going to elaborate on at least one of these to explain this a little clearer. But if we have a natural inclination to truth, then if we waste our gifts, if we have an apathy or such towards, trying to glean the truth from the world, that would be a secondary precept against our natural inclination. Against preservation of life, murder, suicide, abortion, self-harm, against procreation, homosexuality, contraception, masturbation, and then against living in society, anything that worked against solidarity, particularly racism. So I just want to briefly explain how you can transition from primary to secondary precepts here. For instance, if I say one of my primary inclinations is to preserve my own life, so in other words, nobody has to tell me to struggle, to come up out of the water if somebody's trying to hold me under. We know we have the self-inclination to help save ourselves, right? If I can just apply a little bit of reason to that, it helps me understand the secondary precepts that some other person really is simply another me who must preserve their own life. So if both they and I, let me say it this way, if both you and I have to preserve our own lives, and I know your inclination is self-preservation and my inclination is self-preservation, then my secondary precept is I have to help you. So I can say then that murder is wrong. Now, of course, murder appears in one of our commandments. I'll talk briefly what that means in a second. But the reality is that we don't need that type of revelation to know this. This is something that everybody should know based on the primary precept of self-preservation. Now, remote precepts, these are still reasonable, but they're not known by everyone because there's a lot of circumstances that have to factor in. And one must reason, into the speculative principles that are necessary to form these precepts. So, from the Catholic Encyclopedia, let me quote this. These may remain unknown to, or even be misinterpreted, even by persons whose intellectual development is considerable. To reach these more remote precepts, many facts and minor conclusions must be correctly appreciated, and in estimating their value, a person may easily err, and consequently, without moral fault, come to a false conclusion. So 2 great examples of remote precepts of the natural law would be the principle of double effect, which is the PDE, and the just war theory. So let me just real quick explain the principle of double effect briefly, because we're going to cover this in the bioethics section. If I know that primarily as a precept we have self-preservation as a natural inclination, and a secondary precept, once I have placed rational knowledge on that, I know that murder is wrong because that does not allow another to self-preserve. What happens when I have a scenario that presents itself where I have 2 effects, one good and one bad? In other words, I have a double effect. For instance, an ectopic pregnancy or such. The way for us to work this out through all the circumstances and the various conclusions that are necessary to reach along the way, we would say that given certain conditions, and there's 4, this too would be licit, even though it may at first blush say, well, isn't one of these things doing something that we would say ordinarily is not good? We'd say yes, ordinarily it isn't. It's not a matter of being relative. I don't want to get into what PDE is yet. But you could nonetheless to see between this and just war theory that there's a lot of other factors that have to come into consideration. So as far as natural law, these 10 commandments, they belong, which come to us as divine law, they belong to God's revelation just like natural law. And quite honestly, they teach us, how the true human person is to themselves. They bring light to essential duties, but therefore, and indirectly, the fundamental rights inherent in the nature of the person, as in the Decalogue, that's just a privileged expression of natural law. In other words, we know this without having to have anybody tell us, but it's also that important that God has revealed it divinely to us. It's almost, by a weak analogy, you're sending a spouse to go get something at the market. You said what you needed. They said, I understood. And you're like, that's fine. Please, by all means, take this list too as you go, because it's that important. So, nonetheless, the way that St. Irenaeus puts it is, from the beginning, God has implanted in the heart of man the precepts of natural law, but then he was content to remind him of them. This was the Decalogue. So overall, this understanding of natural law implies that man is without excuse. Doesn't matter if a Christian, Jew, from some other belief system, if deny Christ outright or practically, atheistic or agnostic, or even people who have never had any opportunity to have the gospel presented to them. It's a law written on their hearts. So look into the book of Romans. Paul talks about it in verse 120 and verse 212. It's the way God rules the universe with wisdom and directs everything towards his divine fulfillment. The fourth type of law is human law. Now, we often call these positive laws. So these are drawn from natural law, or should be, and reason. Even like the founding fathers in the United States, they weren't theists in the way that we are. They may have been deists, but even when they talk about inalienable rights, that's something that cannot be earned and neither can it be lost. So it's a human law based on natural law, which is a participation in eternal law, how it should be. So anyway, the natural law and reason, they include both positive statutory and legislative law and common law, which arrive from custom and usage, not legislation per se. So we'd say that these laws, they emanate from nature and they're approved by custom. In fact, that's how common law is. It's, canon law. It's something that's been approved by custom. It's tweaked. Let's put it that way. So I want to tie this in now as we move into some other ethical systems to John Paul II's Veritatis Splendor. You can see that in this understanding of law, particularly natural law, it's not legalistic. It's what is good for the human person. Self-preservation is a law, but it's not a law that's being imposed on somebody. It's a law that they know what they should be doing without anybody having to tell them that. So if it's not based on some legalistic system, it can still retain an essential teleological character. In other words, it's still ordered somewhere. It has a goal. It consists in the deliberate ordering of the human acts to God. And remember, God's the supreme good and the ultimate end, the ultimate telos. So this is attested to once more by the question posed by the young rich ruler to Jesus. When he went up to Jesus and said, "What good must I do to have eternal life?" It was already inherently known by that young man that there was some good to be pursued in order for him to have eternal life. Now, a lot of Catholic moral theology, particularly bioethics, is natural law based, but obviously it's not the only type of ethic held. So I'm not going to try to be exhaustive with this, but I am going to at least give you a brief description of some of what I would call the major competing ethical systems. Now, utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, or consequentialism, is an ethical system that talks about the rightness of the act, and it's determined solely by the goodness of the overall consequences. So the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, there are variations on this. There's act utilitarianism, egotistical utilitarianism, principle utilitarianism. We're not going to go into them all right now. Advocates of these would have been John Stuart Mill, mid-19th century, Jeremy Bentham, and even within the Catholic Church, somebody like Richard McCormick from around the year 2000. Now, what this means is that the consequence includes the action itself and everything the action causes. So consequentialism isn't just crassly about results. You'll hear it said that it's just the end justifies the means. That's sort of true, but it's not at any expense, so we don't want to misrepresent it. This is a very popular ethic in the secular society, so it's important that we have some understanding of it. So anyway, the success of the consequences always have to be taken into account. So even if we do sum it up, the unjustifies the means, just understand that the action is only deemed wrong when it does not ipso facto intend the wrong. So everything goes away from the moral object and strictly to the intention. Now, the view of moral consequentialism here, it's to spread happiness and relieve suffering. So we would not argue against its intention. As far as spreading freedom, it's also there, but it's more autonomy and to promote the survival of the species. So so it has some good ends, and it doesn't mean that in every last way that it's going to conflict with what I would present as natural law ethic. The natural law ethic, I should have at least mentioned, even though it's almost strictly Catholic now, doesn't necessarily need to be so. As a matter of fact, the ancient Greeks held it. So the Stoics held it, the early church held it. Today, though, the Catholics are the one, and there's reasons for that. The Catholics are the one that primarily promote it, we should say it that way. So what are some criticisms of utilitarianism? Well, if you're going to say that the end justifies the means, or that you can talk about an evil means being employed to have a good result, because all you want is a good intention. So you can have an individual who simply wants to have an affair because it brings them pleasure. Now, the other problem is that if we're going to talk about the overall goodness, there's going to be a lot of disagreement as to what constitutes good, because if you have a nominalistic view where there are no natures or essences, and that is, quite frankly, our present society, then what is good? Is it what's popular? Is it what is, democratically the majority? Is it what the powerful have? It's impossible to say. The third criticism, and I think this is the best one, you can never predict future consequences. In other words, you never know the side effects of a thing that may or may not show up for a good 20 years. I'm not going to try to make the case here, but we have had women on hormonal contraception since the early 1970s. That's a lot of estrogen that has both flooded the system, the wombs, and society. We are basically in a large experiment. If somebody were to say it could have no effect, that would not be honest. If we're going to say we're certain it has a bad effect, it may be our duty to try to explain what that is. My whole point is that the effects that came down the line, 50 years later, weren't something that was part of the original calculus. Another clear example would be IVF, in vitro fertilization. The so-called test tube baby from 1978, one thing they never really considered then was that at some point they would be having multiple embryos that would not be used in the process and therefore be cryogenically frozen. So now we have frozen embryos in a perilous state. That people can say that's good or bad, but what I'm saying is, regardless if a person says it's good or bad, isn't the point. That was never part of the original calculus. So how can you predict all the future consequences when you're not aware of what exactly those might be? Now, let's see. Let's do proportionalism. Proportionalism, this is a utilitarian ethic like consequentialism, but it's sort of like in Catholic circles known as revisionism. So if you want to call it Catholic utilitarianism, that may not be accurate, but it's also not terribly wrong. This ethical system holds that there are moral precepts, which we hold as true, unless there's proportionate reason. In other words, you weigh the proportion of good and evil in a situation. And then you might be able to go against the rules that under ordinary circumstances you would say are proper. So the context of the situation could lead to overturn moral precepts that otherwise you would accept to be firm. Now, the initial proponent, we would say, perhaps I'm saying they're pulling this from Jeremy Bentham. There is a distinction between how Bentham and Mills understood consequentialism. But this really became a post-conciliar after Vatican II revision of morality within the Catholic community. So you're looking at Joseph Fuchs, Peter Nauer, and such. It's a post-Vatican II ethical theory. Now, if crass proportionalism would simply weigh the good, the positives, and the bad, negative, modern proportionists, we would say, they compare and evaluate all the possibilities that are available for any particular moral choice. And they argue that without taking the agent's intention into account, one is left only with the physical determination. In other words, If you don't have the intention as being a modifier for whether or not it's good or bad, then all you have is what they call ontic or premoral goodness or evils. So these are things that arise prior, they're part of the act, but you don't place moral judgment on them because they come prior, they do not get considered in the act. So one, if you want me to boil this down to something simple, there are no intrinsic evils in this particular thing. So they try their best to associate Aquinas' view of interior and exterior acts and such. Now, once you take away the fact there's no objective evil, there's another issue that comes here. Certain ethical theories that we call teleological here, which normally we're always trying to look towards a goal, but these are only a goal that only considers the intention. They claim to be concerned for the conformity of human acts, with the ends pursued, by the agent and with the values that are intended. The criteria for evaluating the moral rightness of an action, it's only drawn from weighing of the non-moral or premoral goods to be gained, and the corresponding non-moral, premoral values to be respected. So the evaluation of the consequences of the action, they're based on a proportion between the act and its effects, and between the effects themselves. This would regard only the premoral order, so they can almost like remove those. The moral specificity of acts, that is their goodness or evil, is determined exclusively by the faithlessness of the person to the highest values of charity and prudence. This is from Veritatis Splendor. So without this faithlessness necessarily being incompatible with choices contrary to our certain particular moral precepts. You can look that up in Veritatis Splendor 74. The ontic or premoral evils, again, these are the lacks of perfections to which the human person aims, right? So it's to lack sight. If a person lacks sight, that's a physical evil. It's a material evil. But it's limited in some perfection. In other words, it affects his familial or religious life or social life. And those are handicaps. And those handicaps impedes man's actions. And those handicaps themselves are known as ontic or premoral evils. So it's some deficiency that frustrates our inclinations. So again, they're not saying that there aren't rules to govern inclinations, but there's something that frustrates them. And what frustrates them are these premoral ontic evils. They obstruct the goals, right? So this means there's creaturely limitations. It's a negative value. They actually call it disvalue. For instance, it might be true that, like with sexual intercourse, but somebody other than your spouse is a moral evil. So to have sex, that would be adultery. It is not always, and in every case, an absolute moral evil according to proportionalists, as there may be some greater good achieved, or it's done for proportionate reason after weighing the positive and negative values. So the evil in some case of having sexual intercourse with somebody other than your spouse could be only an ontic or premoral disvalue evil. It doesn't get figured into the act. Okay, so besides not recognizing an objective or intrinsic evil, how do you, when we talk about something being incommensurable, if you're going to weigh them out, how do you weigh out the evil of committing adultery with your spouse to the pleasure and happiness that you foresee by having an extramarital affair from somebody who you feel loves you? We can't, if you ever went to the doctor and they say, how bad does it hurt on a scale of 1 to 10? We try, but what is an 8 or a 6 or a 9 or a 4? We just know that one's greater than the other. A lot of these things, it's impossible for us to actually add something to. So if you want a historical example of this, it would be morally permissible to force sterilize certain individuals if it helps stabilize a family or the size of a community, because there's greater goals there. The sterilization effect, it's not really the true end, because what you really wanted to do is you're really trying to stabilize the family or the community. So the sterilization is a premoral ontic evil. The intention is to stabilize the family and for the good of the community. All right, a couple more. Deontology. This is Immanuel Kant. So what he did here was try to do an ethic based on reason alone. So the morality of the act is by judging it in terms of its conformity to both duties, well, not both, but duties, rules, and obligations. So this follows what Immanuel Kant called the categorical imperative. It's a simple term. Categorical means across the board. So if you never if you never did something wrong and you're being accused of doing something wrong, you deny it categorically. An imperative is you have to do it. So the categorical imperative is to act only according to that maxim, by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In other words, you can't do it yourself unless you can say everybody can do it. So you're aiming at discovering a rule that is true in all circumstances. This is duty-based. It comes from the Greek word dion, which means, that binding duty and such. So the method here is to be morally licit. Your duty or obligation has to be tested by simply asking, can I universally hold this? The ethic itself, deontology, focuses on the rightness or the wrongness of the act, and not the consequences or the virtue of the agent. So natural law, it's not looking for something that's good within the human person, it's looking at something that is good for the overall community, and it's not looking at the intention. As a matter of fact, it doesn't care about the intention, it only cares that you've done what's right in the end. So what these duties may include, the duty of beneficence. Like, in other words, when you help others, doesn't that increase pleasure and character? Yes. Well, then we should do that. The principle of non-maleficence, don't harm other people. So if you don't want people to harm you, you don't harm others. If you think you want to harm somebody else, you ask yourself, can everybody do it? No? Okay, then we can't harm anybody. Justice, others are due certain things, reparations, when you're wrong, gratitude. It's about keeping promises. Two classic examples of deontology applied are both murder. You cannot murder somebody, because if you could murder somebody, then somebody would have to be able to murder you. And lie. If you were able to not tell the truth, then you'd have to expect others to not tell the truth to you, and society would basically, crumble. The criticism to this, it really only focuses on what you should do, not who you should be. It's not even talking about the type of person you should be as a virtuous person. And the priority here is entirely on the right. It's not even asking what is good. Unfortunately, this can be what's popularly thought to be correct. Maybe not entirely, but somewhat. The biggest criticism is that what do you do when you have competing duties? So the classic example is if you lived in Germany in the early 1940s and you were hiding Jews in your basement because you have an obligation to protect others from direct harm because that's what you want yourself. And if Gestapo bangs on the door and says, are you hiding any Jews in the basement? Now you also can't lie, because the thing is with the duty to these principles is that they are irrevocable and there's no exceptions. So what is it that you do here? You're stuck. Do I lie and therefore break a categorical imperative, or do I give up the Jews and then they're killed, and do I give and then have that as my categorical imperative that I have basically forfeited? Nonetheless, one of the problems. The last thing here is situation ethics. Now, situation ethics arose out of Joseph Fletcher, a Protestant minister, and an advocate is also John Dewey. A little bit, even though John Dewey comes prior, he still held some of these means in the same way that Fletcher expressed them. Now, the ethical system here is motivated solely by love. So this is really a consequential ethic, but rather than the overall goodness of the consequences, it's the overall amount of love determined in the circumstances. So the priority is always basically going to be on how do we form love. Now, this has much more flexible guidelines, so it doesn't have rigid principles. So this is easy for some people to accept. If you want to decide on an action, then you follow the general guidelines instead of the rigid principles, because you're always taking circumstances into effect. And you want to achieve the well-being of others, because moral judgments, they're decisions. They would say they're not conclusions. So the only absolute is love. They take us from 1 John 5:8. Though the rightness of an action must take in all the elements of the act. So it's the totality of the end, the means and the motive, and any foreseeable consequences. Problem, if love is the intention, then the end may justify the means. I'll give you an example for that shortly. Plus, we're back to what exactly is the definition of love. Is it desire? Is it what a person wants? And ethical results are going to inevitably vary. So this ethical system can or produce injustice. In other words, an injustice is, when you think of it as a double standard, it's two standards applied to the same situation. So if you're always trying to say, well, we're going to be flexible here, it could be that you were lenient in one instance and not lenient in another. That's an injustice in itself. And here, too, there's not going to be any inherent evils or inherent goods, except love, however that might be defined. So, an example, and this is a true story. A woman was held in a concentration camp. She became pregnant by a prison guard because the only way to get out of the camp was to become pregnant. So even though she was married, in order to get out of the camp and escape, in order to be reunited with her family, she became pregnant. Is that a heroic act of love, which be more important than the act of adultery, or is the act of adultery, from a deontological point of view, not allowed, or from the utilitarian proportional view, is it a preontic evil, or are we still having the overall goodness, or does this go against one of our primary precepts? My point here is that you're going to have an ethic applied, and then you are going to need to be, how we want to say, ethically consistent. So nonetheless, one can see that the Catholic Church here has quite a different view of how, with natural law and the three fonts of morality, the object, the intention, and the circumstance, how they're applied. What we're looking at is human flourishing and these moral fonts, and we're always tying this into the nature of the human person, and then in the end, the claim is that as long as these things are in line, law preserves freedom. So therefore, law is not opposed to freedom. It's the only way that we could be free. So a little longer than most. I hope this helps a little bit. Thanks for listening.